I might just stand in this while I preach. Jonathan's got an idea there. Finish up our series on David, Lessons from a Flawed King today. We have walked with David from him being chosen and anointed by the prophet Samuel to him defeating Goliath, and then the power struggle as Saul held on to his power and David grew in popularity, and then David becoming king, and David then falling as Nathan has called him out. We learned last week about David's actions with Bathsheba and sending Uriah to be killed in battle. And now we come to the consequence of David's actions as Nathan calls him out. Nathan being the prophet that has risen after Samuel. Natural consequences is something I heard a lot about as I then went and had to figure out how to be a parent. Natural consequences is anything that would happen naturally. It's kind of the thing that we try to do with kids, where we don't necessarily interfere as much because there are certain natural consequences. When you stand in the rain, you get wet. When you don't eat, you're just going to be hungry and go to bed hungry. When you forget your coat, you get cold. And if you are a serious natural consequence adherent, which I wasn't very good at, adults often we want to piggyback and we want to lecture and scold and we want to say, I told you so, or anything that adds more blame or maybe even shame or some pain, then the child might experience more than the child would experience naturally from their actions. This is a hard thing to adhere to, and again, I don't always. There's also logical consequences which do allow some interference and offering things like timeouts and whatnot. I think natural and logical together might work. But there are natural consequences to our choices. There are things that happen because we make A or B choice that are naturally going to happen as a consequence of what we've done. In our country, we have quite a justice system that doesn't always employ natural consequences. Obama recently visited a prison and gave a speech, and he called for prison reform, especially around nonviolent crimes. He pointed out how illogical and how unnatural many of the punishments are for some nonviolent crimes, that sometimes there's people serving 20, 30, 40 years because of 3 strikes laws for selling, say, marijuana. It's 30 years an appropriate sentence for that. Because we spend over $80 billion on the prison system every year. And he also pointed out that $80 billion would provide universal free pre-K care for every 3 and 4-year-old in our country for a year. Something that many would say would help prevent people from entering lives of crime. Now, it's always hard when we get into how should we respond to people who break the law. It's always hard to figure out what's right and what we should do and how far we should go. This is always a difficult thing. We know there has to be consequences. We have to have consequences in the world. Every parent knows there has to be some sort of consequence so your child just doesn't run roughshod over you. Every parent knows that you need to respond, and hopefully respond in a way that's safe and loving, because we know if we don't, those consequences are going to happen by choices they choose when they become adults, and are going to happen by institutions and people who aren't as safe or loving and certainly don't have as much mercy as a parent might show. And so it's important to teach the idea of consequences, natural and logical, to our children. And that's true in Jewish law. A lot of Jewish law is just natural consequences or logical consequences. If you kill somebody's ox, then you've got to pay the money or buy them another ox. A lot of the law is based on just what seems logical. You take something away from somebody, then you've got to give it back to them. And even the fact that if you kill somebody, then your life will be taken. So that law was built on this kind of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of system. So David knew about consequences. He knew the laws of his people. He had a sense of justice, and that's even shown in this scripture that was read. He is shown and told this story by Nathan about a rich man who didn't want to just give up one lamb for a feast, and so he stole the one lamb that a poor guy had and offered that. And David was incensed, saying, that man needs to pay back, and make him pay back fourfold, because what's one lamb to him? It should be proportional. He should feel it, so make him give 4 back. David was incensed. He had a sense of justice, and then Nathan turns on him and says, but you are the man, David. Conviction. And there is consequence. And what's the logical consequence of taking a life of another or sending another man and intentionally having him killed in battle? What is the cost for that? In the law, murder would be your life for his life. But David is powerful. He's a king who is going to challenge the king and the prophets who were brave. And he shows that he has an abuse of that power. Here, where Nathan reminds David of all that God had given to him. That God had risen David up, had given him so much, had put him in his place as king, had promised that his line would be the line that would change humanity forever. And yet, he has sinned. He has failed. And what would be the consequences for this David, this promised one? Well, one, Nathan says that his house would now be plagued with violence. He lived by the sword, he died by the sword. That David contributed and continued cycles of violence, and that would continue through his reign. And it certainly did. Also, that David would lose wives, and he had more than one. He would lose wives because he took the wife of another. And that happened as well. But this last one, as we heard, the last verse of this passage that was read, was that the child that was the whole reason for David doing what he did, of getting Bathsheba pregnant, that child would die. David would not die, but an innocent child would. Well, that's a strange consequence. It doesn't seem neither natural or logical. Yes, the child is important to David, especially the son, an heir. But the loss is so utterly tragic. It's an innocent child who had no choice in how they were conceived. Surely the loss would flood for David emotions over what he had done because of this child, because of the conception of this child. He sent a man to die, and how bitter it would feel that this child would end up dying as well after he had done all that. You know, sometimes the supernatural consequences we read about in the Bible seem neither natural or logical. The whole biblical story has been told, we have read and been told, has been one about choices and consequences. From the beginning, when Adam and Eve disobeyed and ate from the one tree they weren't supposed to eat from, there would be consequences. Why did God put that tree in there in the first place? It's almost like God wanted them to eat the fruit. I mean, we've got sons, and we try to get to them eat, and we both, for a while, worked to say, oh, don't you dare eat that broccoli. Don't you dare. And they would pick it up, and they would laugh, and they would eat it. They just loved doing what we told them not to do. That only worked for a little bit. And what did they get for eating that fruit? Banished from paradise, from Eden? Given pain in childbirth and having to toil and work in this world. Wow, what a punishment. And not only for them, but with the development of this idea of original sin, the curse continues to every single descendant of them from throughout history to us. Noah in the Bible got drunk and naked, and when his son Ham saw him and it didn't help but told his other brothers, who walked backwards to cover him up so they wouldn't see him, well, Ham was cursed, and all of his descendants were cursed to end up being the servants to his brother's descendants. Wow. Is that a natural consequence? To curse generations and generations of people for one man's oversight. Lot's wife, she turns around to look at the city, her home destroyed, and she is turned into a pillar of salt. Wow. The consequences in the Bible don't seem too natural or logical many times. They seem kind of harsh. And this idea of original sin, which really developed later, and Augustine really definitely had a lot to say about it, depends on circular logic. It's not really logical unless you have certain beliefs and faith in place already that you accept universally. And it's not universally accepted in the same way by all branches of the church universal. Many of them have ideas of what sin is and how sin has come to be and how sin has become inescapable by our actions. But it's not all the same. For instance, the Orthodox Church says that the descendants of Adam and Eve inherit consequences, but not the guilt. So there were consequences that were for all humankind, but not the guilt for every single descendant. Original sin, or sin, is a captivating idea to explain all the bad stuff that humans do in the world. To explain why this messianic king, David, who seemed like the best shot for Israel to be the righteous and holy leader of Israel, would let everyone down and hurt so many. It explains a lot of why so many fail at trying to do good. And it's easy to find anecdotal proofs throughout history that there is some kind of curse that keeps humans from getting it right. And so it's a popular doctrine of original sin, that we are all sinful and need saving. That's the basis of the beginning of the gospel. However, I have also seen how the doctrine of sin, and original sin in particular, has bred a very cynical church. One that has a hard time ascribing any kind of good to humanity, is cynical and skeptical of anybody's actions for good. Especially deeds that are done by people who don't believe the way they do. If it's not done by a Christian, then it can't be too good. I see a church that spouts this. It's very cynical, works against humanistic endeavors to right wrongs, to bridge inequity, to challenge injustices in the world. So I think this doctrine has kind of also poisoned much of the church to be negative and pessimistic about humankind. That we're all cursed, supernaturally cursed, and have no hope in this life. And the only good will be the salvation through Jesus and a new world that sometime will come when he comes again. So often I see church leaders speak or work against good efforts, good things, because of this view. I once grew up with this view, and as a child, I felt cursed. As a child, with so much happening and seeing suffering around me, seeing my brother struggle, seeing my parents divorce, seeing my brother die, struggling with my own hereditary dysthymia, which is persistent depression, caused me to feel cursed. And the only antidote the church ever told me was Jesus. But Jesus never fixed those things, as much as I try and pray. There are millions of others who have been told, you're born cursed. You're cursed to be gay. It's just not right, and you're just living with a curse. Or you're cursed to be trapped in a gender that you do not identify with. Cursed to be transgendered. And the faith of the parents or the communities that they grew up in just remind them over and over again that no, it's a curse, it's wrong, it's a sin, and you're cursed. To your very core of your identity, you're cursed. And dashes any hope of knowing promise of life, promise of good life. So many of them naturally give up, turn to drugs, become homeless, or ultimately kill themselves. And the numbers do not lie. It's so much higher for those that the church and religions have called cursed. Those kind of supernatural consequences do not make sense to me. However, there's another way to look at it. Not so much focusing on original sin, but focusing on original blessing. And Matthew Fox, a Dominican priest who became an Episcopal priest when Pope Benedict kicked him out, wrote a book called Original Blessing. Fox talks about a paradigm in 4 sections. One, that we befriend creation, view the positive, that God said it is good in the beginning. That's the original blessing. It is good. Befriending even the darkness in us. Not letting fear and anxiety of it or denial of it drive us so much, but being in touch with it, understanding it, admitting it, and being okay that yes, we have dark sides. If we don't talk about it, it does much more damage than if we can talk about it. Being able to let go and let be. Befriending creativity. Befriending that nature, that image of God, that divinity that God works into us of being in the image of God. Of being able to create. There's so many wonderful artists and writers in our community, sculptors here in our church who show that creativity and in music all the time. Befriending new creation. Befriending that things can continually be made new. That's what we celebrate in the gospel. That there is compassion and justice that we celebrate. Fox says the forces of fear and pessimism so prevalent in society and religion need to be countered by an increased awareness of awe and of goodness. Not to be so pessimistic. Throughout his book, he celebrates the wonder of creation, the royal personhood or priesthood of individuals. And each chapter begins with a treasure trove of thought-provoking quotations from various religious writers throughout church history, Julia of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, Dorothy Day, and others. It's a good book. Often, though, our theology is so wrapped up and focuses on so much of what's not right that we paint a picture of a God who's just obsessed with what's not right. A God who's just pessimistic, the perfectionist father or mother who's always pointing out what's wrong. But the evidence is contrary to that, because God wants to bless. God wanted to bless David. And when David confesses, he's quickly told, you won't die. God does not withdraw the ultimate promise of David. David's lineage, God's plan would not be thwarted by David's actions, could not be changed by anything David did, by any mistake he made. And that's good news. God's promise cannot be changed by anything we do. Jesus showing God's love to people, showing God's blessing to people who were called sinners, forgiving them, rescuing them from being stoned, facing up to people, saying you are blessed, challenging the notion that God was unapproachable or too far away, showing us that the divine and humanity were meant to exist together, intertwined, that the promise and blessing of God is that God creates in us vessels for God's Spirit. And they killed him for that. But even Jesus' murder could not change God's blessing or promise. Because it cannot be stopped by anything we do, by anything David did, by anything Adam did, by anything we do. It cannot be stopped. God lives through everyone and can. And even through David, who is light side and even his dark side. Because God is not stopped. God can live and work and change in the hearts of those incarcerated. And certainly God can work through people of all races and all genders, all sexualities. And God can live through the transgender and work to help others, just as I felt God worked through Caitlyn Jenner, giving so many hope in her advocacy. Some churches see what they see happening in our country and with the Supreme Court and with this decision on same-sex marriage and the openness to the transgender. It's evidence of more human sinfulness and wickedness. But I don't see it that way. I don't get it, this pessimism. I rather see signs that God is working in people to change our pessimistic and judgmental attitudes to ones of grace and love and mercy for people. Recognizing that the blessing of God is not withheld from anybody. Not one. That we are not defined by our mistakes, yet we might face consequences. They do not define us. They do not rob from us the chance to know God's blessing. And we are not defined by others' judgmental opinions either. No, we are defined by God. This does not happen supernaturally. To know this, to know God's blessing, I don't think it happens supernaturally. It happens when we find that blessing through our communities, through each other, when we find those friends, that church, that community, those professionals who love and bless instead of judge and condemn. It happens when we work ourselves to be self-aware and doing the work to change those things that blind us to the blessing, changing our pessimism to hope and optimism. Yes, we are like David, as the litany we read said. We are chosen and ordained to be God's people. We are given the faith to fight giants. We are placed in places of power that is beyond what we deserve. And we make mistakes and we fall like David. And we face consequences like David. Yet we also are forgiven like David. We are blessed like David. And we are reminded that the promise is for us. Each one of us. And so we live into that original blessing. We live into that original goodness that God created us in. And each day, get up with an optimistic and hopeful attitude for what God can do through us together. May it be so. Amen.